Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to talk to Özgür Koca. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for the invitation, Paul.
Great to have you on, sir. Dr. Özgür is an associate professor of Islamic studies and philosophy at the Bayan Islamic Graduate School in Los Angeles. His work focuses on the intersection of Islamic theology, philosophy, and spirituality in classical and post-classical Islam. He also examines the implications of these legacies for the realities of modern Islam. He was awarded the Fisher Faculty Teaching Award for Excellence in Teaching. He is the author of Islam, Causality, and Freedom from the Medieval to the Modern Era, published by Cambridge University Press. Islam, Causality, and Science, also published by Cambridge. He's currently working on a monograph tentatively entitled Islam, Existence and Consciousness, a survey on the principles and applications of Islamic metaphysics. Now, you've just published an exciting new book in the Cambridge Elements series called Elements in Science, Elements in Islam and Science. Could you perhaps introduce us to your new book?
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali sayyidina Muhammad. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul lisani yafqahu qawli. Now, my book is titled as Islam, Causality, and Science. Perhaps I should say first why I start thinking about the question of causality, and then why I think this question is very central to the modern religion and science debate in general, but Islam and science debates in particular. The question of causality is an important one for many reasons. In fact, in my view, it's like the constant background of many discussions that we're having in theology, philosophy, even in our daily lives, in politics and things like that, in economy. It's like the constant background of almost all debates.
Yes.
Our conscious or unconscious presumptions about causality shapes our answers too. I can give a couple of examples. In theology, for example, when you start thinking about a God and cosmos relationship, you usually, the question of causality is naturally involved in it.
Yeah.
Because, there's a big difference between seeing God as a first cause, a first mover at the end of a long chain of causality. That is a perception of the divine based on your perception of causality. But there's also another option, which we are going to see in the coming slides, to see God as the creator of each cause and effect. Now,
Right.
in the first option, you're going to find God at the end of the causal chain, but the second, the divine presence will overwhelm you. So there's that type of, how you perceive the relationship in causal relations and its relationship to their relationship to God is very, very central. In theology, for example, when we talk about the proofs of God, we usually also base our discussions on how we perceive causality. You can't really discuss anything without it. So in spirituality, you can find, again, the very, very heavily presence of it. And how you pray to God, for example. Are you praying to a God, like a disinterested, perhaps very distant, or praying to a God which creates all events and acts even that you are involved in? That type of God and cosmos relationship, how you perceive God and cosmos relationship, shape, fashion, also how you pray, in what spiritual state. In fact, actually, one spiritual state, according to Tasawwuf tradition, is one's awareness of the divine intimacy, divine presence. The whole discussion on the ihsan, for example, right? That divine presence has a lot to do with how you perceive the causal relationships in the world. So also the question of freedom, again, one of very, very, very central. What is to be free? If to be free is to be an uncaused cause of yourself, then it cannot really be discussed without an awareness of causality, the question of causality. If you're describing what freedom is, if it's not an illusion, but it's real, then we seem to be breaking the chain of causality all the time when we are acting as free agents. So I mean, why is freedom is an important question for theologically? Why is that an important question? Because everything else appears to be based on that. And the reward and punishment, for example, hell and heaven, right? I mean, if we are free agents, then we should be deserving the reward and punishment. And if we are not, all of that seems to be collapsing. More, divine. If we are not truly, causally efficacious free agents, then morality also seems to be collapsing too.
Indeed.
So all of that. I mean, you can see the causality is like that constant background almost of many questions that we're discussing. You can say the same thing for logic. I mean, but specifically, I will be focusing on this in this book on the question of religion and science.
Yes.
I mean, again, religion and science debate appears to be, in my view, and I argue that in the book, to the question of causality. We discussed many issues when it comes to religion and science. I mean, theory of evolution, quantum theory, its implications, and many things. But in the background, again, or one can say it boils down to the question of causality at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at the debate between evolution and creationism. I mean, as they say. Yeah. I mean, one appears to be allowing some causal disruptions or negation of causality, so that divine intervention, creation of each species, distinctly.
Yes.
But evolution wants to provide a cause-based explanation to the whole thing. So it's actually a debate between causality. I mean, among their perception of causality, one sees possibility of breaks in the causal chain. The other wants to provide or sees the universe as a causally closed system. Mm-hmm. Therefore, provides an explanation. So, I think to be aware of the importance of the question of causality is quite important when we are having all of these discussions. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to draw attention to the centrality of it, or its presence in all discussions, and try to have a debate on the basis of that. So that's why I see the question of causality as being a very important one.
Mm-hmm.
Should I continue?
Please. I do have questions, but I'm going to wait to a later slide before I jump in. Thank you.
Okay. So what do we have in the Islamic tradition when we ask this question? The Muslim thinkers, scholars, they thought deeply about this question. So we have a lot. It's a very rich, and I think quite a big accumulation of wisdom and knowledge that we find. So I was able to identify three main doctrines, theories in the Islamic tradition. One of them is being presented by Mu'tazilite, and the other one is being presented by mostly Ash'ari scholars, Islamic occasions account of causality, but also defended by some Maturidis too.
Right. Yeah.
So, Maturidi tradition does not seem to be spending a lot of time on this question, but they seem to be usually agreeing with the Ash'aris on this question.
Yeah. The difference between the two schools is somewhat unclear to me sometimes, but anyway.
On the we also have a Islamic participatory account of causality. This, by the way, I believe I'm the first one who is arguing this existence of this in the Islamic tradition. Right. Participatory account also providing, I think, this as a tradition. In my first book, I'm trying to map out, and I'm looking at Islamic philosophical and spiritual philosophies, Islamic falsafa and tasawwuf, but especially Sufi metaphysics. Ibn Arabi and his followers. In the Islamic falsafa tradition, one can argue, I believe, someone like Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd defending different versions of participatory accounts. Also, in the Ishraqiyun, in the Illuminationists, the Islamic Illuminationist philosophical tradition, I'm talking about people like Suhrawardi and Mullah Sadra. They seem to be leaning towards a more participatory understanding of causality, and I'm going to try to, briefly describe what that means in the following slides. So, Mu'tazilite account of causality. I have a slide for that. Okay. So Mu'tazilite account of causality. In the book, I argued that to be able to understand what their doctrine of causality is doing, I think one needs to understand the central concern of their theological project.
Yeah.
So Mu'tazilite theological project appears to centralize one or two doctrines, and as they also themselves accept. They call themselves al-tawhid wal-adl, the people of oneness and justice. So this is how they used to call themselves. In fact, actually, since oneness also is defended by many other schools, their most distinctive feature appears to be the question of justice.
Yes.
No, God must be justice, and in fact, necessarily is just. I mean, not only is choosing, but necessarily. So this justice question is very central, and that actually shapes their doctrine of causality too. Because to be able to have justice, what we need to have real creative powers in the world. We need to be free and creative agents. If God is judging us without giving us any meaningful power or any meaningful power to choose, then God is unjust,
right? According
to their view. Yeah. Hence, we must have something, and they call it, this created power, istita, qudra. They call that we human beings, we do have this power, which is actually bestowed upon us by God. We're separate agents in a way. We have this power, and we act on our own now. Mm-hmm. Then, therefore, the question of justice, on the one hand, requires that we should have, the establishment of justice, on the one hand, requires we should be causally efficacious agents, real agents. But on the other hand, it also requires the intelligibility of the world and the divine acts. We need to be able to also understand that they should be accessible to us. The intelligibility of the world is very, very central. I think this is why you see them leaning towards, the understanding of causality in a very rigorous sense, that causal relationships do not break. I mean, from a wheat seed, you will not grow a barley or something like that. I mean, that will never happen for them, because otherwise you're going to lose the intelligibility of the world. Right. Also, intelligibility of the divine acts, therefore the divine justice.
Right, yeah.
Okay, we are not looking at an arbitrary king. They hate that idea that, God is not an arbitrary king, yeah. Or therefore the world is understood. And I think this theological concern is shaping their understanding of causality as well. And we see in them that in the world, beings are causally efficacious. In human beings, we have this power to choose, but also in beings, we have this tabi'ah, this nature, which is given to them by God. There are also laws. So the makers of the world basically are like two things. There are laws and natures in the world, but there's also our power to choose. And these two come together and it makes the world. God doesn't really, is not really like intervening in this process. Right. But is that giving us a God, the God of deism? I'm going to discuss that in the coming slides. I think they are not also, they're away from that.
Because the number of things in your account there do suggest, if these doctrines were in a very strong form, ideas that would be very controversial in Islam. So the idea that we have our own power, intrinsic power to choose, we are free, it sets one over. How does that work with the sovereignty of God? That God is the owner and cause of all things. So that's one issue. And then you kind of mentioned this kind of, in a strong form, this doctrine may have deistic kind of tendencies. So God is detached and remote from the world, and that may question miracles, perhaps, or the supernatural, and so because that somehow might compromise the intelligibility of the world if it was disrupted by these unpredictable miraculous signs or events. And I can see how various iterations of that in certain strong forms would perhaps be seen as extremely controversial. Indeed, have been seen as extremely controversial by other Islamic thinkers.
Yeah. It is controversial. But as I'm going to, so I'm just presenting the doctrines here, but I'll be evaluating their strengths and weaknesses in the following slides.
Perfect.
And you're right in seeing that some of these ideas are controversial, and some of them may lead to certain unwanted, I think, consequences, even by Mu'tazilis themselves. But they also seem to be, more careful a lot of the times than like the competing schools are depicting them when it comes to issues like that. I think it's very hard to see them as defenders of a certain form of deism, because God is not like disinterested as in deism. Because the very question of justice requires a very interested God.
Yes.
Okay. Because watch, God is very present, at least with his knowledge, ilm, in that regard. But I think they are separating God in terms of power. Like if you think about the divine attributes and names, I think they're allowing the presence of certain attributes in their robust senses, but they seem to be, I think, drawing boundaries around certain other attributes. That might be issues. But I mean, I think we need to be, we need to be able to see that too. So Mu'tazilis are giving us this picture. So I'm gonna, I think, have to just be short here and ask the reader to read the whole section because I'm giving a lot of references.
We'll link this. Put a link in the description below. People can follow this up themselves.
Okay. So necessity and causality, perhaps I can just say a few words about this. The causal relationships, therefore, are necessary. I mean, there is this necessity, not only in the causal relationships, but also in divine acts. For example, God cannot do, not only does not do, but also cannot do certain morally wrong things, such as lying, or such as injustice again. So this will be also, they allow certain necessity in divine acts too. So
and also there's a standard of justice or rightness or wrongness over against God, that God can't do it because there is a standard by which he is held accountable to. I know that's not said explicitly, but it almost feels like that there's somehow that there is a standard called justice, like a platonic form, which God would not go against.
So as if I think they seem to be imagining morality as a larger framework, which even encompasses God, and God should act in accordance with those values.
Yes.
In fact, however, as I'm going to say, perhaps I just mention it here, their theory of attributes of God, in fact, allows this to see these attributes, such as justice, also as being one with God's essence. So they do not really separate divine attributes from the divine essence, as if it is like dissolved in it.
I see.
It's one and the same thing with the divine essence. If this is true, perhaps they can say when God is acting in certain ways, he's just conforming to his own essence.
Nature.
This is not going against his freedom. It's actually precisely what is to be free. Perhaps God is acting necessarily, but this can be reconciled with the idea that God is also acting freely. God is acting freely and necessarily is reconciled in the divine essence.
Right.
But they don't say that actually, because although their theory of attributes allow this, they don't seem to be saying this. In my view, this is because of in their time, the Islamic metaphysical thought was still in a state of development, and they were able to, I believe, catch certain nuances, which is going to come in the following centuries. They're gonna actually present this as a solution to this problem.
Right. Okay.
And I'm gonna come to that too. Should I continue?
Please. Very interesting stuff. This is very interesting. Occasionalism.
Yeah, occasionalism. I think this is the most well-known theory of causality in Islam. Islam occasionalism basically is the idea that God is the creator of both cause and effect.
So God is the creator of both causes
and
effects.
And And he attaches them to each other on a self-imposed habitual patterns. So there are also divine habits. So God is not creating the world is a completely arbitrary, chaotic fashion. Right. So there are laws, and these laws, from an Ash'ari theological point of view, are the divine habits, self-imposed divine habits. God is self-limiting Himself. So when God is creating the world, in fact, since this very idea of habits also for some will also give us the divine character, because what is like habits? When you study the world, you actually may be studying the divine character. Therefore, but the idea is here very, very briefly. God is the creator of both cause and effect, and He attaches them on a predictable, consistent, habitual patterns. So but why is this happening, and why Ash'arism is leaning towards this doctrine? I think one can find the answer. In my view, the central concern of Ash'ari theological project, is the preservation of divine will and sovereignty. So they centralize this divine freedom and sovereignty. They put that at the very center of the theological project. Remember, I said something about Mu'tazilis. They seem to be centralizing divine justice. That's their main thing, as if the central axis around which everything else revolves, right? And for Ash'arism, I think one can say this: the irada, divine freedom, and sovereignty are the main things. Like they stay at the very center of the whole thing, and then they start interpreting everything else by starting from this central axis. They go everywhere from this. And divine will, why? How is this related? No. Once it is God who is creating cause and effect, right? And now you're removing the causal glue, you're removing the causal glue. Now the world before you, now it's God who's creating this cause and effect, and the idea of necessity is done with. I mean, it's going away. I mean, it's negated because there's no necessary relationships. Right. Since there is no necessary relationships between cause and effect, and these relationships sometimes they can be negated, and they will have a name for this, naqsul ada, or they will have called it very differently, but it basically means negation of habits. So divine habits might change. So God is creating in certain ways, but God may also create in completely other ways. So divine habits might change. So what does divine habits do? They secure the predictability of the world for Ash'arism. They secure the predictability, intelligibility of the world. But also, again, divine freedom should be preserved because but God should not be bound by causal necessities. Therefore, these causal necessities can be negated, and this is why miracles happen. This is actually the explanation given for the miracles. The miracles are negations of causality.
So are they saying that, on this account, that there is no causality at all outside of the divine will? I mean, that we may think there's causality. Al-Ghazali gave the example of fire and wool apparently burning. So fire apparently burning the wool, but this is a mere coincidence of assemblages. It's not an actual cause and effect we're seeing. I think
in a certain sense they seem to be saying that it's almost like a mental construction that we come up with. This may be likened to perhaps David Hume's explanation of that. Causal relationships. I think there's something that we mentally construct by looking at the habitual creation of God in the world. Then we, although there are no necessary connections, since they are always happening all the time, we kind of impose that necessity. So that necessity is our mental construction. So that's Ash'arism.
And this really is to preserve, as you say, the freedom and the sovereignty of the divine will. This is all so loaded. It has to be the case.
Yeah. On the one hand, this preserves for Esharism the divine will, obviously, because there are no necessities that can change. Things. And it's not bound by these necessities, as Mu'tazilism would disagree with this, as we were saying, right? They do not allow such disruptions. But Esharism allows it. This preserves divine will on the one hand, but on the other hand is also, if you think about the divine power, if it is God who is creating both cause and effect, so this really fills one's world with the divine presence, like immediately. I mean, imagine now I am speaking, right? I mean, you are listening to me. I mean, just try to imagine this like a really well-trained, practicing, right, Ash'ari theologian. Like now I'm speaking. All I'm doing is to, so there are like billions of things are happening in my brain right now, right? Also in my muscles. Billions of things. Like when I'm talking about molecular level, particle level, atomic level interactions happening in my brain, right? And also they're happening in your brain too, right? Right now when we are speaking, and also my tongue, and then I'm moving my tongue and I'm making some sounds, and these sounds are then transmitted by the air to my computer, and my computer transmits it to the wires, and they are coming to your screen, and then your and from your screen these sounds are coming to your ear, and your ear are taking them and working on them and doing, then give them meaning, and then we can, therefore in this very instant we can have this conversation, and billions of things are happening, billions of things. But we gloss over these things, but if we really slow down and contemplate on it,
we just take them for granted as just sort of natural or everyday, but they're not. They are remarkable. The more you break it down, the more incredible it becomes, scientifically, let alone philosophically.
And if you also think like in terms of Islam vocational account here, God is the creator of both cause and effect, and it is each event like being created at this moment. The world is being recreated anew at each moment. I mean, then this will lead to that idea too. They will then say us, the world is being recreated, not only space, things, but also time itself. Time will be atomized as well. The world will be created anew at each moment, as if we are looking at a pulsating world. We are pulsating between existence and non-existence.
So what would an analogy be like in those really old films, those old black and white films? So you saw the film reel, and each frame was one picture, like a photograph of the scene. But if you played the whole reel very quickly, it gave the illusion of a seamless event taking place before your eyes on the film. In fact, if you really slowed it down, like really got into the detail of it, you would see individual snapshots, i.e. individual creations of time, space, imagery, action, whatever. So, but I mean, I don't want to get into arguing about it now, but it does strike me that this undermines the whole of science, because if causality in any sense is purely a fiction, an illusion, which it must be on this account, I would argue, then how can one have a science? I suppose you'd base it on the habits of God, as you put it. But it seems to be an illusion. It doesn't really have any roots. It's just a surface reading rather than an engagement with what is objectively really there. It's not really there, although we're going to pretend for the sake of our science that it is. And it seems a very odd theory to have in the light of that.
I think from Islam vocation's point of view, one can argue for the possibility of doing serious science or preserving the rigorous scientific study of the world. But there appears to be also certain problems, as I also am going to allude to in the following. Should it wait for that?
No, I don't interrupt. Your flow here. Sorry, I'm just I can't help myself by thinking, hang on, this means that science is all a facade. It's not really real. And because I just want to point out to people, by the way, that you were an actual physicist, an actual mathematician, an academic before you moved into philosophy and Kalam and theology and so on. So you can speak with expertise in both dimensions, which is wonderful.
Thank you. I'm going to evaluate the merits and weaknesses, in my view, of this theory in terms of reconciliation of religious and scientific views of the world. So I'm going to be talking about that. That's actually, what the purpose of this book is, to look at these theories, not without caricaturizing them, but in their depth. Look at these theories and then see whether one of them is really can carry the weight of this discussion between Islam and science. Yes. So that's what I'm trying to do here.
Wonderful.
And also I'm going to try to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses, and that's what I'm doing in the third chapter of the book.
Right.
In the first chapter, I am just mapping out. I'm just giving descriptions of what these theories are.
Yeah.
So atomism is actually a physical ontology which kind of grounds these theological ideas.
Yeah.
So atoms, in this view now, are also being recreated anew at each moment. These atoms. Right. They don't have any intrinsic natures. They are completely neutral before the divine action. It is God who's giving them all the accidents, auras, differentiating them from each other. It is God who is doing this in the atomic level, but also recreating them because they cannot subsist by themselves. So there is this constant recreation of the world. Atoms are, and they give us an atomic view. Some of these ideas may be difficult to accept today because, this all non-different atoms to which God is giving certain accidents to differentiate them. God is like the differentiators of atoms, therefore differentiators of all beings.
Yeah.
And almost like it's God who is differentiating the whole beings from each other. As if here, if this is a dialogue between God and the world really is silent. We do not really have any feedback in a way. One can argue. So there will be some problems here too. Although it has a lot of power in terms of creating this robust sense of divine presence, also solving certain theological problems, but it also seems to be inviting certain other, issues, and one can, I think, challenge certain ideas here, which I will do in the next slide.
Can't wait.
Acquisition is the theory now. So why do they need this? Acquisition is the theory of Casp. As you can see, the problem of human freedom will arise if you accept the strong forms of this theory, right? Because if it is God who is creating both cause and effect, all causes and all effects, and if my choice is a cause, right, then my choice also is being created by God. But then, why will I be held responsible for my choices then? If God is also causing my choices. So what are we going to do about this? One of the solutions they offer is we do not create, they say, but we only acquire. Therefore, the power of acquisition. But then again, one can ask, why do we acquire one thing rather than the other? Isn't that a choice? So it seems to be like a regress here. Just they seem to be like delaying the problem one step further without really solving it. So this will be a big issue in Ash'ari occasionalist doctrine. In fact, some not Ash'arism, but some Maturidi scholars, as far as I am aware, I'm also giving that discussion in the book, will try to solve this problem. But in my view, again, even those solutions still are open to challenges. So basically, this is what the Islamic occasionalist theory is trying to achieve. It tries to establish very strong sense of divine freedom, divine sovereignty, divine presence. This again is a response to Mu'tazili theory in its early forms. So since it is the response, I believe, and we should always keep that in mind. Every response might be limited by its opponent's challenge. So I think we'll do that in the following sections, inshallah. Okay, let me also introduce this one here. It's not a participatory account of causality. So I gave so far two, Mu'tazilism and Ash'arism. This one is not really unique to one theological school. One needs to, I believe, read both Islamic philosophical and spiritual tradition. But when I say spiritual Sufism, I really mean one particular school. Sometimes people call it Akbarian metaphysics. Sometimes, Vujudiyya, as in a more traditional sense. Why Vujudiyya? Because of the centrality of question of being. Wujud means existence or being. So again, we can read this in comparison to preceding two. If Mu'tazilism is centralizing the question of justice, if Ash'arism is centralizing the question of divine freedom, for this school, it is the question of being. It lies at the very center of everything, because it is it's the most universal category. You cannot really go out of that. I mean, being is the ultimate
ontology.
It's like you can't really go beyond being. I mean, if there is something beyond being, that will have to exist too.
Yeah,
we're still within being. I mean, so there's this very and in my view, quite unparalleled attention given to the very question of being. By the way, I'm not talking about beings here. I'm a being, you're a being, right? I'm not talking about beings.
You're talking about ontology, as it's called in philosophy.
Yeah, being qua being. That's what we're talking about.
Qua being,
Being qua being. Or al-wujud min haythu huwa huwa, as in Arabic. No, al-wujud min haythu huwa huwa. I mean, that's being qua being, pure being I'm talking about. Like, that's the most evident concept in a way. We all know what it is. We all know that we exist, right? Even when we question it, we should exist to be able to question it.
Is there any difference between existence and being then? I mean, are they different modalities or the same?
No, I'm just, I think there's two ways of translating it in this English and the philosophical text. They sometimes use existence, sometimes being.
Okay.
But in Islamic traditions, pretty consistently, it's always wujud.
Yeah, being.
Wujud.
Yeah.
And wujud, in a way, by the way, it's an interesting term because it also means a couple of other things too. When they are very important. Wujud, on the one hand, means existence or being, however you want to go with it. On the other hand, it also shares root with the verb wajada, which means finding. Wujud also to find, like also an epistemological act too. Like you are aware of, you're knowing, you're finding something. Therefore, it's not only an ontological term like being, but it's also being conscious of it. Therefore, it's also an epistemological term. And I'll give you another one. It also means, especially in the Sufi circles, the term wajid means ecstasy. It also has the meaning of this bliss, serenity sense in it too. So being, also knowing, and also bliss, they come together within this term.
Interesting.
So it's a very, very rich term. It has its own history. In my coming book, I'll be talking about the history of this term. The Islamic metaphysics that you also mentioned, the principles and applications of Islamic metaphysics. I'm looking at the term itself and its richness and what type of philosophical horizons it can open for us when it is understood in its true richness. So the term wujud is quite central in Islamic philosophy and Islamic spirituality, Sufi metaphysics. And this is where we find this theory. So the question of causality, if you will be contextualized within the larger framework of being.
Right.
Because what is causality? Causality is this principle regulating the relationships of beings, right? This glass and this atom and this tree, whatever. I mean, the relationships of beings. Causality is give us there's the principality in it within the relation of beings. There's cause and effect. However, being kind of stands above it, always also with it, because being should be given to beings so that they can interact with each other. So this theory is quite deep, but also requires, I believe, a certain contemplation too, because it's not like readily available. One needs to spend some time on it in a way. But there are analogies we can use, and one of them is ocean and wave. One can use them to imagine it. I mean, imagine waves, right, on the faces of ocean, like beings. These are like waves interacting with each other. This is what the world is.
Right.
But there's also ocean.
Right.
Now, a trained eye can see both ocean and the wave.
Wow.
But if you're only a scientist, or if you are not really trained, if you are not open to this, perhaps you're only seeing the waves.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps an ecstatic, Sufi or a mystic only seeing the ocean in a state of fana, annihilation. Okay, but a trained, really a mind, which sees both with both eyes, both being and beings. And being here appears to be the background, the ground of all causal relationships, without which you can't really think any causality. And all causal relationships are going to, like the relationship of these waves, if you will. Therefore, science doesn't really ask the question of being.
No.
Because science asks the question of, causality. It wants to give us a causal map of the whole world. Isn't that so?
Yeah.
I mean, what we do in science, in fact, is we are trying to draw the causal map of the world, from the atoms, from the particles, up to galaxies. Without leaving any gap. That's what we're trying to do in science, and that's a very, very admirable, I believe, inquiry. But even in that, we do not ask the question of being, really, because we take the world as existing, really, and we work on that. This question only is being asked in metaphysics, even among the even within the Islamic, within the philosophical disciplines. Only metaphysics seems to be asking this question, and I mean, to be honest, it's only the traditional metaphysics, actually, because nowadays the metaphysics is not being taught in this way in many philosophical departments, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
But in traditional metaphysics, this is at the very center, the very question. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. For example, the very, very term wajib al-wujud, the necessary existence. Again, you will see the find of the term wujud there too. Al-wajib al-wujud, like the necessary existence.
And the contingent.
This is seen as like modality, right? There's the necessary existence, there's possible existence, and there's also impossible. So he kind of differentiates between the two, and he does this on the basis of the notion of being again. And perhaps another way to think about it again within the Sufi metaphysics, the very doctrine of wahdat al-wujud, again, the unity of being, right?
Is there, if I may, I mean, I don't anticipate your discussion, but is there not a slight danger here of monism, the idea that everything ultimately is one? And I say a danger because I was thinking of just to switch to a different tradition, the medieval Christian tradition. Duns Scotus, one of the great philosophers of Christendom during the medieval period, he is sometimes accused or credited with the view that of the movement from the classical position, which saw God's ontology, God's existence as wholly unique and transcendent, and we as creatures exist, but our existence is completely contingent and not like his existence.
Yeah,
and it's sometimes said that with Duns Scotus, who was a Scottish priest and an eminent theologian, one of the four great philosophers or theologians of the medieval period, with him, he seemed to posit that God's existence and our existence have one thing in common, and that was the set of existence. We exist, he exists. So we understand, and this was like the slippery slope where God became almost domesticated in the Western. I'm not saying Islamic, in the Western tradition, where he became almost like an actor within the universe. And so you had a competing. Is it evolution or was it God? Without. Yeah. So is this sense of God sharing one property with us, existence, whereas previously and in Islam, I think in the Quran anyway, God's existence is actually completely different from our existence. Although we can use the word, they're not the same, and there's a difference. So monism implied in this position, arguably, that I think of the ocean wave duality, because it suggests ultimately we're all the same substance, does it not?
You're right. So there are some challenges of this view too. One needs to clarify.
Okay.
So look, perhaps I can just start the discussion. I can use this analogy again. In both Mu'tazilism and Ash'arism, one actually see a type of a duality, as if God is here and the world is here, and God is watching or creating or influencing the world with His attributes, right? As if there's like boundaries in a way. There's this relationship of duality.
Yes.
In this participatory account, this duality is really removed. But it doesn't really leading us towards like a robust monism, like we lose ourselves in it. It doesn't seem to be that way because of the very idea of participation.
Okay.
One can argue at least that way, and not only me, the major representatives of, let's say, Sufi metaphysics, for example, they don't see their theory as being one of monism, really.
Okay.
They do establish the agency in the created world, and I'm going to talk about how they want to do it. Actually,
okay,
agency of freedom of beings, and also this very participation actually will be the way to establish human freedom. Because only by participating in the divine freedom, they will say, we are free.
Yeah.
Can you say, this participation will not prevent us from acknowledging our agency. It will actually be the very ground of it.
Right.
Because of this, and they will also see some theological issues with that idea of like separation of the world and God. Because if God is infinite, there really can't be separation. If you're understanding what you mean by the term infinite, really, there really cannot be any taqyid, if you will, like boundaries or limits to this divine presence. And not only they're talking about, of course, divine God's essence, not attributes. Although in some theological schools there's a distinction being done between attributes and essence.
Yes.
In this tradition, the divine essence will be. Cannot really be. You can't really put boundaries around it. Divine essence and everything else is taking place. I'm not going to say just within, because that's going to imply certain speciality in it, but also, that type of non-duality in a way. And I'll talk more about this when I am evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of this theory.
Very good. I look forward to that.
Okay. So. But basically, they will try to preserve the agency and freedom and the dignity of the created order before God.
Okay.
And they're gonna move away from that type of robust pantheisms, even panentheism, in my view.
Panentheism, that everything is God, but some things, not everything is God, but some things, most things are God, but some bits of God are not.
Panentheism, everything is in God. Like it's not even that. This theory, this I believe, this understanding, this metaphysical elevation in a way, right? It's not real. It's really hard to encapsulate with one word, especially by using terms like pantheism or panentheism or monism. They don't seem to be doing justice to the.
I remember trying to wrestle with Spinoza's metaphysics, his concept of God, the Benedict Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher. And there's a similar wrestling over exactly how do you describe his worldview. Is it pantheist? No. Is it panentheist? Well, not really. Is it this? Is it that? Einstein thought he was a pantheist, but maybe he wasn't. It's very slippery and it's not very clear. Anyway, that just reminded me of him.
Thank you. So this is I think this should suffice for the introduction of this. We'll come back to this now. So this is the first chapter, is trying to map out and outline what is available to us in the tradition.
Yes.
So there's a lot of historical research in that first chapter. Second chapter moves to the modern day, because I want to understand what really the question is. The challenge is in the modern religion and science debates appear to be this reconciliation of the divine causality with modern science. Mm-hmm. The question of divine causality. If the world is a causally closed system, as many modern scientists would nowadays might want to argue for, then how do you really understand divine causality? So there is that challenge. So how do you do with that? So first, in this second chapter, also look at the discussions that are taking place in the among the Christian, some Christian theologians, also Jewish theologians, and some also. What they do is there's this tendency to read theologically certain scientific theories, such as quantum theory, chaos theory, emergence theory, and to understand divine action in light of these. How? I can give a couple of examples. Think about chaos theory. So chaos theory basically is telling us chaotic systems, non-linear systems such as atmosphere, they are very highly dependent on the initial conditions. And even the slightest change in the initial conditions will lead to a drastic change. A good example of this, I guess, is a butterfly is flapping his wings here, and a hurricane is happening in Tokyo a few months after, or something like that. So this is so. How do they use this theory? They say perhaps God is acting by introducing these infinitely small inputs to the system, therefore creating change in the world. So why do they say this? Because in chaos theory, for one of the major representatives of this the theological interpretation is Polkinghorne. And he seems to be arguing that this very small inputs is creating change, and without really negating the causal sequences. So he's preserving causality, but also introducing a divine presence or divine action to the world.
Polkinghorne was very interesting, John Polkinghorne, because he was a professor of mathematical physics at Cambridge University. And then later in life, he became a Christian priest. He left the Cambridge, as a scientist anyway, and wrote extremely eloquently on science and religion. Actually, I have a number of his books. Actually, I remember when I was a Christian, benefiting enormously from them, because he's an extremely eminent scientist who took theology very seriously. Actually,
this is he's one of the I believe leading scholars in this field. One of the general tendency in these writings is to, on the one hand, preserve the scientific view of the world, like this causal rigorosity of the world. But on the other hand, I think finding spaces in which God can be introducing certain influence to the world. Some of them will be doing this by starting from the quantum theory. As you might know, quantum indeterminacy for them is suggesting a certain causal openness in the world, but at the particle level, not higher levels. So perhaps God is acting in this atomic particle level without us noticing it. We can't really detect divine influence if it is that small. I mean, that's one of their views. God may be acting in the particle level, and this the inaccessibility of those domains for us is allowing God to act, therefore create change. I mean, one example is that perhaps God is acting in those domains and creating certain mutations in our cells, and then perhaps also guiding the evolutionary process, something like that. Am I making sense?
Yep, making sense.
Some will argue by starting from emergence theory. People like Alvin Plantinga. Also, no, not Plantinga. This is the Peacock. Sorry, Arthur Peacock, and then
Arthur Peacock, another Cambridge, another English scientist, I think.
Yeah, and someone like Philip Clayton, a good friend of mine. So emergence theory, for him, they use emergence theory, and emergence theory is basically the idea is that things like consciousness, although they depend upon brain lower level structures, they cannot be reduced to them. So they dependent upon, but not reducible to, brain, like consciousness. So if consciousness is something like that, and if divine influence is occurring through consciousness, then we can't really detect it scientifically. And such influence will not really be breaking the causal chain, but it will introduce change. For example, we'll have an enlightening idea. One can think about a good poem, or someone like Shakespeare writing beautifully and influencing the societies, or things like that. I mean, this consciousness as an emerging phenomenon is allowing them to think about divine action without really breaking or harming the rigorous scientific research. I mean, they don't. One of the things that and I agree with that. They did not want to put any a priori boundary before the scientific research. I mean, let science go as far as it can. I mean, no theory perhaps, theologically risky in that way, but that's what they do. But these theories, in my view, also can be these scholars who are trying to find some space in which God can act, right? In which God can act can also be criticized.
Yeah.
And my next slide will offer certain, I think, ways to do that.
Yeah. That exactly. Yeah.
So one of the things that comes to my mind, and I believe perhaps it may have something to do with our being Muslim and like this, are we really just suggesting a competition between God and other causes here?
Absolutely.
Because the very idea that God is acting in these spaces, small spaces, we're trying to find some certain. Is this a new form of God of the gaps, for example? I mean, or is this is there really a competition between God and the other causes? The very presumptions in these doctrines, in these theological debates, appears to be this to me.
I agree, and you see this in Polkinghorne to some extent as well, and it's very disappointing, really. Actually, but God becomes an actor amongst other actors. He's almost an agency within the universe, completely losing the classical transcendent conception of God, or what you were saying earlier about being itself. It seems to have been lost, and it's almost the domestication of God, and then God becomes a problem. How does God act within the world? And this is a peculiarly, sadly, Christian or post-Christian problem in the West, and it's not something that is a problem for Islamic metaphysics, I don't think, classically. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's why I have issues with these solutions. Although I find them brilliant in certain cases, but I believe they finally ended up not really solving the problem.
No.
So because of these concerns, it seems to be reducing God to the level of other causes.
Absolutely.
So that's the biggest issue.
And that's a problem with Christian theology in general. It's already reduced God to a human being anyway in the incarnation, but also God becomes so immanent, and this transcendence is so lost in a lot of Christian theology in the West. that these kinds of so-called difficulties arise, and it's an indication of how much Christian theology has lost its way, rather than genuine problems for theology as such. At least that's my view.
Yeah, I agree with you. Another issue may be the problem of tentativeness. If you can see, this chaos theory, quantum theory, and emergence theory, and other theories, relativity, special, general, there is this intrinsic tentativeness in the scientific theories. And I think any theological solutions which is based on a current state of a scientific theory may suffer this problem of tentativeness. It can only be a tentative solution, I guess. Not really giving us because chaotic systems are incalculable now, but perhaps with AI they will be calculable. Although we may need very, very big computers for that, perhaps as big as a city, but still, at least in principle, they may be calculable. And when that happens, then talking horse theory may just be useless. So this tentativeness, I believe, should be kept in mind. If we are looking for tentative solutions, tentative theological solutions, perhaps it may work. But if that's not the case, the problem not going to fly.
Yeah.
So there are other issues too that I indicate in the book, but I'm just going to, I believe, let the reader read them.
Yeah.
So these are that was the question: how to think about. So my question is how to really commit ourselves to scientific, rigorous study of the world without really undermining our main commitments. So that is, can we do that really by using what is available to us? So I then went on to summarize. There are actually 4 challenges in facing us when it comes to this. One of them is the question of method, and I'll explain what this means. The other one is the question of miracles, question of divine and creaturely freedom, and the question of divine presence. With the question of method, I mean this. I think our theory of causality should give us the freedom or comfort not to see any scientific theory as theologically risky. It shouldn't also draw any boundaries around scientific research, like not in a priori boundaries. There may be some a priori boundaries, but but within the domain which can be studied causally, I think we shouldn't have to commit ourselves to some gaps or some spaces in which God can act and things like that. So the question of method, scientific method, the strength and the merit of it should be preserved. Perhaps I'm also saying this as a former scientist someone who taught physics and math for many years. Science is dear to me. I think we gotta have. What makes it intact? There's some merit in it, a lot of beauty in it. I see. So the other one is the question of miracles. So if the causal processes are not broken, or then how do we explain miracles? Or then should we just reduce miracles into some form of literal tools or analogies or metaphors, as sometimes some theologians suggested? My view is that there can be a way, and I am arguing for that in the book. There can be a way in which we can see miracles not as metaphors, like we can keep their reality as they are mentioned in the text, the staff of Moses and everything, right? So we got to keep their reality, because that's the conviction of Islamic tradition for many, many centuries. So we got to keep their reality, but should we also turn them into sign stoppers? How do we deal with this question? So there's also this question of miracles, and I'm discussing this too. The question of divine and creaturely freedom. So our theory of causality should also be able to allow us to see creaturely freedom, because almost all religion is based on that. Moral obligations, accountability. The very idea of accountability cannot really be thought without having some certain freedom in us. Creaturely freedom should be preserved, but also divine freedom should be preserved. Because, again, this Islamic theological conviction, God is divine freedom. And the freedom should not really be confiscated by divine necessity or something like that. So divine and creaturely freedom should be preserved. Our theory of causality should allow that. The question of divine presence also because of the robust presence of Allah in the world, in Allah. So as we were mentioning in this previous slide, God should not be reduced to acting in certain spaces and finding some gaps and some. I mean, the robustness of divine presence, God's closeness, as well as God's transcendence, both transcendence and immanence, be preserved by the doctrine itself. So if you think about it, for example, some theories see God only at the end of the chain of causality, like the first mover or first cause. To me, it seems like you're losing the divine presence then. Some theories bring God here, as Esharism does, like cause and effect is being created, the world is recreated any at each moment, an amazing divine presence. But both divine transcendence and immanence, how do we deal with this question? Also, when we talk about divine presence, immediately the question of theodicy also comes to mind too, because of this robust presence. Then how do you really deal with the question of, therefore, evil and suffering in the world? So there are certain, as we can see, some of them here are directly related to science. Some of them are more theological in nature. So the very last chapter are looking at these 4 questions. If you ask these 4 questions to that 3 theories of causality, how can they really answer? Can they pass test, if you will? I mean, and then in this one, I'm actually putting these ideas in dialogue with these theories. And here I am kind of navigating that discussion, I guess. Here I will have to then speak. I'm not only talking as a historian, just picturing or describing what is in the history, but also now I'm taking them and putting them in dialogue with a burning question. So I actually have a quote here which can also summarize what I just said, these 4 challenges.
Right.
As my view, the proposed account of causality should be strong enough to preserve scientific rigor without imposing a priori limits to scientific research or falling into interventionism. Like the spaces, finding spaces. The second one is to account for miracles without turning them into sign stoppers or metaphors. The third one is to secure the divine and creaturely freedom without sacrificing the causal rigor in the world. Here, the question of freedom. But also this freedom, the idea of freedom and the causal rigor should go hand in hand. There are also necessities in the world and causality in the world and all of that. 4, to establish a strong sense of divine presence in the world. So can our theory of causality do this? Or can Mu'tazilism or Esharism or participatory accounts, can they do this? Can they answer these questions? These seems to be the essential questions to me. There may be other questions too, but I just wanted to, I believe, one can add to this list. But I believe these are the 4 most important ones. Okay?
Yep, okay.
And so then I am starting to evaluate these theories by asking this question: the question of method, the question of miracles, the question of divine and creaturely freedom, and the question of presence. So then I can talk about each evaluation. But I think I can just keep it brief, I guess. It's been a while now already. Okay. In my view, the Mu'tazilite account of causality, when it comes to question of method, I think this is the strongest part of Mu'tazilite account of causality because of their insistence on the necessary relationships between events. Their causality is the causality is necessary for them. It's not really being so it really rejects the idea of intervention here. Therefore, their role is predictable, consistent, which is the very basis of scientific method nowadays. It is based on the predictability, consistency of natural processes. So Mu'tazilite account of causality when it comes to question of method appears to really be strong. It actually can suggest a type of a methodological naturalism, with which, when I say methodological naturalism, it is different from metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism doesn't accept anything beyond nature, right? That's just nature, and that's it. But methodological naturalism actually suggests that the world can be studied as if it is it's a causally closed system, but there's also higher realities which created it. So in a way, I mean, for a Mu'tazili theologian, studying the world as if it's a causally closed system doesn't really posit any problem. So Mu'tazilism appears to be strong in this regard. How about the miracles? Can they really give us a really convincing explanation without turning them into a metaphor? For Mu'tazilism, by the way, in their theological writings, they do accept miracles.
Right.
But when it comes to dealing with it in accordance or in consistence with their doctrine of causality, there seems to be certain issues. Because how are you going to talk about miracles if you're not accepting any disruptions in causality? Or if you're really distancing God and the world, really that much? If you're taking away the divine power from the world? Okay, if you are reducing God as if to only a watcher. So how are you going to deal with this one? Mu'tazili account appears to be so you might have certain proposals available to them. Actually, I tried to think about what can a Mu'tazili theologian say about this. Perhaps they can say, God created the world in the beginning in a way in which, when the time comes, the Moses staff will turn into a serpent. Right? As if everything is created from in the beginning by God, like a watch, if you will. And when the time comes, the watch ticks at that very specific moment. Okay, but this might suggest I have a degree of determinism, which actually is not consistent with their theory. So there are some theological conundrums for them to answer. And after all these discussions, I concluded that when it comes to the question of miracles, the Mu'tazili theory is quite weak. Of course, a modern Mu'tazili theologian might disagree with me, but I'm asking some serious questions there in this chapter on Mu'tazili doctrine and its strengths and weaknesses. So when it comes to the first question, method, it's very strong. But on the question of miracles, there are some issues. On the question of divine and creaturely freedom. So again, divine and creaturely freedom, when it comes to creaturely freedom, this theory is very strong because they do see a certain power in us, like bestowed upon us by God. There's almost like a separation there. God is giving that power, creating in us that power. It's not only like created together with the act, but before the act, we always carry that within us. Willpower, if you will. So there's that, and with that we can choose. So they're very, very libertarian in their theory, if you will. But how about the divine freedom? Can their theory preserve that too? As I said in the beginning, previously, I think when we were discussing the Mu'tazili theory, I said something there. When it comes to divine freedom, there are certain issues because they seem to be placing God within a larger moral framework. God should act in accordance with, say, that type of justice, for example. So there's this moral framework as if encompassing God too, and God is acting with an eye on them. So there's a transcending thing, even going beyond God, and then God's acting within a context, if you will. So this seems to be an issue in their theory of morality, when they say things like God cannot do this or cannot do that. This problem, as I said again, might have been solved by using their theory of attributes. Recall, they see attributes as one with the divine essence. So if this is true, when God is acting in certain ways, God is simply conforming to his own essence. And this conformity to one's essence is actually freedom. Even it also has some necessitarian element in it. Perhaps an example from our daily life is, say, and I'm a father, right? And I see my kids, may God forbid, drowning, or like a car is gonna hit to my kid. I'm just running towards it, right? Running towards it. So there is both necessity and freedom in this act, one can argue. Necessity comes from the perfection of my fatherhood, because any perfect, any good father would do that kind of. It's almost like this moral perfection also comes with a necessity in it. The more morally perfect you are, for example, the more morally perfect you are, you cannot lie, even if you wanted to. Okay, this moral perfection comes with a type of necessity, but it also doesn't negate your freedom, because there's also in that not lying, there's also freedom too. So if there's necessity in God, they might have said, if there's necessity in God, it comes from God's moral perfection. And this moral perfection, since it is conformity to one's own nature, not some outside thing, or not being imposed by something outside, but your conformity to your own nature is freedom. Although there is certain, it can also be seen as a type of necessity too. But they don't do this. I mean, this is going to come later. By Islamic participatory account, they will argue how to reconcile divine freedom and divine necessity along these lines. They will do this. But Mu'tazilism don't do that. Perhaps it's, again, the metaphysical thought in Islam has not reached to this elevation yet back in their time. And they're just saying this, God is free, they will say, but also they will also draw certain boundaries. There is some internal tension within their theory. There's an internal tension within the theory itself, a Mu'tazili account of causality. It's not always consistent, one can say. So I have some issues here too. So when it comes to divine freedom, they seem to be not be strong. No, they're not really. The theory is not really strong when it comes to divine freedom, although it is very strong when it comes to creaturely freedom. How about the question of presence? Again, there are certain issues with the idea of presence here. Although God is very close with his knowledge, knows everything, but there is also separation between, in terms of God's power, God's will, and all of that. So certain attributes are allowed to be very strongly, robustly present. Certain attributes are not. So there is this problem of presence in the Mu'tazili, divine presence in the Mu'tazili theory, in my view. So just to summarize, they are strong in certain regards, but quite weak in certain others. And if the reader is willing to, is more curious about why I reached this conclusion, perhaps they can also read those pages where I discuss all of these separately. Okay, how about Ash'ari account of causality, or Islamic vocations account of causality? The question of method, Islamic vocationalism can really give us can really preserve the guiding principles of scientific research, can really preserve them. So Islamic occupations theory can be interpreted in a way in which the world's consistency, predictability can be preserved by leaning on the notion of divine habits. So divine habits, divine habitual creation is the guarantor of the world's consistency. Okay, God doesn't really, act like an arbitrary king. Therefore, there is this consistency in the world process. We can study it. Therefore, so an occasionalist scientist, when he enters or she enters into a lab, I think he or she can study the world in a very same way to a naturalist scientist, I guess. So because of this conviction of the divine habits, is creation. But is that the end of the discussion? I'm afraid not, because again, the negation of causal sequences, causality, is also allowed. In fact, the main objective of the theory is to allow these negations by negating the idea of necessity. Therefore, causal relations can be negated. Therefore, divine freedom can be preserved. So the question arises here: what are the frequency of these negations? I mean, are they happening all the time, or perhaps sometimes, or perhaps once in the universe's lifetime, and all of that? So when it comes to, I think this is also very relevant to the question of miracles here. So in Ash'ari theory of causality, there seems to be no way of limiting the frequency of these disruptions in causality. Their theology doesn't really draw clear boundaries around these. In fact, if you think about the very heavy accentuation of divine will, God does as God wishes, or if you think about their moral theory, in which God can act in arbitrary fashion, in fact, God can lie or things like that. Or if you think about their other theological convictions, in that miracles are not only given to the prophets, but also can be given to liars and impostors. So, am I making sense? I mean, if you think about all of these other convictions of their theological project, they seem to be allowing these negations, these breaks in causal chain, in a very quite often way.
Yeah.
Ghazali is aware of this problem, or someone like Jurjani is also aware of this problem. They are trying to marginalize these events in a way. I'm using this term marginalize. They want to say that these events are not happening all the time, or may not happen, but like they but the other convictions of the other theological convictions, they do not seem to be allowing such marginalization. Therefore, there may be seen as very immediate possibilities. What does this have anything to do with the discussion? Because if such disruptions are immediate possibilities, it may be very hard to instill a culture of this unyielding insistence on causal explanations. And that seems to be the basis of scientific research. There's a tension there. This tension perhaps can be addressed, but I feel that there's that tension that needs to be addressed. At least there's a problem. Perhaps the problem can be solved. Perhaps we do not really exhaust the possibility of Ash'ari theology yet. Perhaps some very strong Ash'ari theology nowadays can address these issues. However, by looking at just the tradition, perhaps because they didn't have to feel the weight of science and religion debate as much as we feel nowadays, but in the preceding tradition, if we're just going to base ourselves on their writings, a tension remains between rigorous scientific method, and certain convictions, theological convictions of Islamic occasionalism. Okay. What about the miracles? I'm sorry. I talked about that. How about the freedom? The question of freedom. I think when it comes to divine freedom, Ash'ari theology, again, their main objective is to preserve divine freedom. Therefore, God does as God wishes. Fa'alun lima yurid seems to be at the very center of their theological projects. Therefore, there's no really issue when it comes to divine freedom. This, again, remember, was an issue for Mu'tazilism. But for Ash'arism, it's very, very strong on this issue. How about creaturely freedom? When it comes to creaturely freedom, there is an issue. At least there's a difficulty. Because, again, as I said, if God is the creator of even our choices, so how can really be free? If we are just acquiring what is created by God, what is the root of that acquisition? Isn't that a choice? And if that is a choice, even that is being created by God. But if even that is being created by God, are we then not ending in some sort of fatalism or determinism, or not really losing our agency in the world? So there are some issues here. And I believe these issues are quite challenging. If we're just going to stick with the Islamic occasionalist theory, there may be some issues. Also, one other issue is that both Mu'tazilism and Ash'arism appears to see a certain competition between human will and power and the divine will and power, probably because of their dualism, if you will. So if I am choosing, if God is choosing something, then I'm not choosing that type of, I think, conclusion is being reached. So because of this separation of the two, this separation of the God and the world comes with small challenges, theological challenges. Challenging because in this context, one does see a competition between divine will and human will, or between divine freedom and human freedom, between divine power and human power. So since they start with this presumption of that separation, then they're trying to solve the problems which are being introduced by this separation. How about the question of presence? So the question of presence, as we understand, if God is the creator of both cause and effect, so it really invites a very, very strong sense of, a robust sense of divine presence. Even my speech right now is being created by Allah. My thoughts, all the activities into my brain, and your thoughts and your brain, all the activities, we are right now is being created by Allah. They also present some very, very insightful and ideas to ground these doctrines. For example, I'm not really consciously controlling what's happening in my brain right now. I mean, when my consciousness doesn't really reach, I only wish to speak, but the rest is being, handled by my body. In my body, when I mean my body, I mean billions of cells and billions of atoms and particles, molecules, and everything that's involving in this process. I mean, it's a mind-blowing thing, really. David Hume once said, if I can move that mountain, like the X-Men, they move things with their minds telepathically. So if I can move that mountain, that will be like a miraculous thing. But it's no less miraculous to think about my speech, because there really is very similar distance in a way, causally speaking, between me wishing to speak and then I am able to speak. It's a mind-blowing thing, really. Is this being too long? I hope.
No. As long as you want, that's fine.
This is the last one, so I'm going to conclude.
Okay.
So evaluation. Participatory account of causality, the question of method, So when it comes to participatory account of causality, since it places the question of causality within the larger context of being, right? That's like the ultimate absolute boundary, like being. So within that, you're thinking about causality now. So causality is being like a secondary issue now when it comes to finding Allah. Right? You're not really finding Allah as at the end of a causal chain, or not. I mean, because being is always with us, and also always on the background. So the causal relation, or their particular causal network, is kind of a secondary now. So whether God is creating through relativity or special relativity, or there is emergence theory, there is chaos theory, there is quantum theory, there is evolution or not. In all these cases, being must be given to them. I mean, since the beings, in what causal scenario beings are relating to each other is not, is secondary here.
You could ask, is this just a version of the contingency argument by Ibn Sina? Is this just a version of that? Because we have necessary being, but everything that exists is contingent and therefore is given its being by the necessary being. Is this another way of formulating the contingency Ibn Sina's contingency argument, or am I missing?
So that's a very, very good question. I'm actually working on a paper nowadays on this one. In my view, this may sound like Ibn Sina's cosmological argument. But this is quite different from that. There's actually a name for this in the tradition.
Okay.
They call this al-Burhan al-Siddiqi, which means the proof of the truthful, which tells us something like this. Look, think about cosmological argument.
Yeah.
In cosmological argument, you're still, explaining things through causality, like that is the uncaused cause of itself. That type of, right? Yeah. So that's a very, very good way of really proving the divine existence. So there are really no issues with that. But this is a little bit different from that because of this. They're going to tell us, look, we actually know God before everything else, because we know being before everything else. So this idea of proving God may actually be veiling, because if you think about being, right, or you just don't think about being, because to be able to think, you should exist first. So being is precognitively available to us. We know being before thought.
Right.
Okay, we do not reach being because, let's say, I want to say I am a professor, right? To be able to say I am a professor, I should be able to say I first, right? Without saying I, there's really no thought. And what is I? It's my awareness of my being. So every thought follows from the evidentiality of being. So if you're trying to find being with thought, you're actually veiling it, like a blurring it, if you will, because that which gives rise to thought is more evident than thought itself.
Yeah. Well, that's like Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology then, which is more like these things are precursors. They are the preconditions of thought itself. A whole range of things, like he would say, or causality and existence itself, and God. God is an a priori that we know axiomatically. It's self-evident that it exists. We don't have to argue to it through a series of syllogisms. It's a precondition of our existence, our understanding of the universe in the first place.
And that is very, I believe Ibn Taymiyyah himself might have been benefiting from some previous writings of Islamic philosophy and Sufi metaphysics in this regard.
I'm sure.
One can see him really benefiting from them, also from Ash'aris too. So, but one thing is that comes to mind here that I can just say, in cosmological argument, you find God as a being, right? Yeah. But in this proof of the truthful, the one that I'm talking about, you find God as being itself. So there's an immense difference between knowing God as a being and knowing God as being itself.
Okay.
Wujud. So it both is acceptable, I believe, from an Islamic point of view, because the Quran seems to be presenting these ways. But the second, the one that I'm talking about here is a little bit, I believe, is just you're not really finding something new. You are waking up to something you already know.
Yeah.
That is what perhaps is going on here. That's that may be the difference between the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument gives us God as the uncaused cause of all events, but this one is gives us God as being itself, and this it is the most evident, most manifest, but also most hidden of all concepts, the being itself. So that is. So this as a side note, of course. When it comes to the question of method, let's go. If you can go back to our discussion, the question of method in this context can really be preserved in my regard, because you don't really need causal gaps to find Allah. And there really is no competition between causality and being, because it is the very ground of it. There really is no competition between causality and wujud, being. Being is the ground of all causal action, the constant background of all causal actions. We are not reducing God to a level of other causes. It is always, present with all causes. All these are following from the plenitude to the infinity of the divine being, or being itself, like the God as being itself. Al-wujud min haythu huwa huwa. So, question of method, I believe, is the participatory account can be quite strong when it comes to this. I mean, no scientific theory is theologically risky, really. I mean, let science go as far as it can. Let's have that comfort. I mean, that type of thing. The question of miracles. In this one, I am suggesting something new. Can participatory accounts solve the question of miracles? Can they talk about miracles while preserving their reality, but also while addressing the causal rigor of the world? So can it do that? In my view, it can. And I'm discussing this, and I'm suggesting a way. Perhaps I can just very briefly talk about it here. And I'm suggesting something like this. Look, in my own experience, I am giving to myself in two ways. I'm a free agent. I know my freedom, it's quite evident. Of course, this is I am saying to someone who believes in the reality of freedom, and I know there are a lot of people who think freedom is just an illusion.
Yeah.
But let's say we are really free beings. We can choose. If that is true, that I always experience my freedom in consistency with causality. Isn't that so? I mean, I am raising my arm. I can easily give you a causal explanation for this. I mean, science can do this. All the signals from my brain to muscles and all these movements and the gravity and everything. And I can give you a causal explanation for this. But this very act also, I experience it in a reconciliation with my own freedom. So it's just evident to me. There's both causality everywhere, but there's also my freedom together with it. If this is true, and if this participatory account is giving us a very, very non-dualist relationship between God and the world, so perhaps we can think about miracles in a similar way. They are expressions of divine freedom. God may to agree with the Esharism, God may be breaking his own habits, or maybe doing something different. Right? They are expressions of divine freedom, but there may be also a presence of causality even in these acts. So this gives us a view of the world, like cosmos, as a very, very causally pregnant. I mean, pregnant to possibilities which we can't even think of. The causal pregnancy, the possibilities intrinsic in the world are just mind-blowing. And when God when wills in that way, perhaps He's creating something new. Perhaps you can use the analogy of a musician. I mean, think about a musician who's playing something we know of, that we heard before, that we are familiar with. But then he starts to improvise and play something nobody has ever heard of before. This musician is still within the boundaries of music's rules of music, or like possibilities of music, but something never heard of before. And I think this may be a way of thinking about them. In this way, in my view, we can preserve the reality of miracles, like as they are stated in the text and in the prophetic traditions. But on the other hand, this also should not necessarily move us away from the causal possibilities embedded in the cosmos. This causality is mind blowing. Like perhaps nowadays with AI technologies, we are trying to remembering it again. But like the causal possibilities embedded in the world, right as we are doing right now, like we are chatting with each other while you're in London, I guess, when I am in California. So this causal possibility is mind blowing, and perhaps if divine freedom requires, perhaps it's happening without really negating its causal nature. So that's what perhaps I am trying to kind of reconcile both Mu'tazili and Ash'ari views here. I'm agreeing with Ash'arism that divine habits may be changing, but also I am agreeing with Mu'tazilis that the causality as a principle is being preserved. So the question of presence, obviously, I think this is one of the strongest aspects of this. As you were asking the question of monism or pantheism and panentheism, all they are stemming from this very, very robust presence of divine being. But how do we solve the problem of freedom? That's another question, an important one. And I believe, and they, in fact, Sufi metaphysics spent a lot of time in thinking about this problem, the creaturely freedom. How can we think about creaturely freedom and agency if there really is no real separation between God and the world? I mean, no identification on the one hand, but also there is really no separation. God is God, world is world for them. I mean, they're very, very clear about that. What defines us is our dependency. God is independent, and that gap can never be breached by the Creator. We need to be given being. Being is, being itself. I mean, that's doesn't need anything else. So that is that. So the creaturely freedom. How can we then, if that is that type of heavy immanence, the presence of God, is this really kind of annihilating us, taking our agency and freedom away from us? No, actually, for them, it's actually the opposite. There again, no competition between divine freedom and creaturely freedom. It's actually divine freedom is the very base of our freedom. We participate in the divine freedom. When being is given to us, since it is also the source of the ground of all divine attributes are intrinsic, are the same with al-wujud, the pure being. To say pure being is to say all attributes of Allah. So when being is given to us, and when this being, so we participate in the divine qualities, and the very ground of our freedom is the divine freedom. So in fact, this is the only way appears to be the only way to find really certain freedom in us, because in all other ways we are not really free. I mean, nowadays, there's a reason atheists, philosophers are moving towards determinism, I guess, because if the world is causally closed system, there really is no way to establish human freedom. That was the tension that Kant also himself felt. And in fact, actually, his whole doctrine of his whole separation between noumena and phenomena appears to be based on this. So creaturely freedom. So there's one way of thinking about this is our participation in divine qualities. I am a free human agent. I'm a free being. Perhaps this freedom, this choosing, it may be also permeating into other beings too. But there's this participation, and therefore, I can say I am free by participating in the divine freedom. There's another way to think about this, and they do this too, and it is this. We all receive divine being in accordance with our own capacity. They will call this our possibility or our essence, mahiyya. Sometimes they will call this our istidad, capacity, or our receptivity. So there's being coming from the one, but we receive it as much as we are. Am I making sense? So there's this receptivity and capacity, this mahiyya, we are possibilities, but these possibilities are known to God eternally. And especially in Ibn Arabi, and I quote him in the book, he actually talks about this, and he says something quite interesting. He says, al-ilm yatba'u al-ma'lum. That means knowledge follows the known, which means God knows us in accordance what we are. That doesn't really make us or determine us, determine what we are, but only knows what we are. Because ma'lum, the known, should precede the knowledge. So on this basis, he will argue, and his followers also will argue that these essences, our reality is really uncreated. They are co-eternal with Allah. They're uncreated, really. There is that uncausedness in a way, in our situation, in a way. So that uncausedness is the ground of our freedom, they will also say. We are uncaused causes of ourselves, at least in certain situations. We taste that divine uncausedness because of that participation, in a way. So what I'm saying, one can still, theologically agree, disagree with these positions, but what I'm saying that they are aware of the problem, and they are, in fact, providing quite, in my view, convincing, quite strong solutions to these. So what I'm gonna say is that I am leaning towards participatory account of causality as being the strongest candidate. When after these evaluations, all of them has some strong sides, some weak sides, but I believe participatory account of causality. The only thing about this, I guess, it is hard to, because beings are very, very abstract. It's very, very hard to talk about.
It's very abstract.
It may sound something mind-bending to some people,
yes.
But if you really are into such high level of metaphysics, then perhaps you may find ways to bring this down to the larger audience. But I find myself usually convinced by this one in most cases. Okay, I actually said this at the end of the book along these lines. In my view, the Islamic participatory account of causality appears to encounter 4 challenges more effectively than the Mu'tazilite and Islamic accounts of causality. It offers a more promising path for reconciling religious and scientific modes of explaining the world. Thank you. Well, it's been much longer than I thought it would be.
That's absolutely fascinating. One of the great virtues of your book is that it's so clear and succinct and accessible. You're not encumbering the reader with lots of obscure jargon, and it's relatively short, of course. The book, the link in the description below. Do recommend you folks, viewers, have a read of it for a very, very good introduction to all these issues, and it really will introduce you to the Islamic tradition in all its incredible philosophical depth. And so thank you very much, Özgür, for your time. Really appreciate it, actually. Do you have any concluding remarks? But I think we've really been through so much. But any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, perhaps just only one thing. When Cambridge asked me to write this book, they also gave me some word limit, so I had to. I had to express certain ideas in a compact manner, I guess. So
because it's a part of a series of books, so you're just one book. So yeah. So
I am apologizing if the book is so dense, but I'm always open to questions and to discuss it.
Yeah, you can put any comments or questions in the beneath the video, actually, and I'll link to the wider series on Islam and science as well. So, and you got a forthcoming book, a monograph coming out shortly. Is that right?
Yeah, I am working on. I am writing a commentary on a traditional work, Sadrat Ekonomizm Miftah al-Ghaib. That would be my own translation and commentary.
Wow.
So I'm gonna be doing something that Islamic tradition done quite often. I'm gonna take a work just to add to the continuation of that philosophical spiritual tradition. I would like to just engage with the work and write about that. It's gonna be a commentary on Sadrat Ekonomizm Miftah al-Ghaib, the key to the unseen. And after that, I am working on another text which is tentatively titled Principles and Applications of Islamic Metaphysics.
That's right. Yeah, that's the one I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah, cool. Fantastic. We look forward to those. Well, thank you.
I hope that was helpful and was able to answer your question.
It is. It is. It's certainly a concise summary of the fundamental issues, and that's invaluable. Actually, it's good to have these accessible monographs for us all to appreciate and benefit from. So, thank you very much again, Özgür, for your time, and look forward to speaking again, inshallah. So, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Paul.